Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new space. I'm glad that you all followed us over here. So today we're going to be doing a workshop. Many of the same house rules apply in terms of this is being recorded. It will be posted later on CosWeb. However, we do not have a Q&A box, so please post your questions in the chat. And please post them to everyone so that I can help the presenters see questions as they come available. I am pleased to have Stephanie Casey, Andrew Ross, and Melody Wilson here with us. Stephanie Casey is an associate professor of mathematics education at Eastern Michigan University, specializing in statistics education and preparing secondary mathematics teachers. She is a co-PI for 2 statistics teacher education curriculum projects, STEM and modules. Andrew Ross teaches calculus, statistics, operations research, and data science at Eastern Michigan University, and is interested in including more about equity and social justice into his course materials. Melody Wilson is a PhD student in mathematics education at the University of Michigan. She is interested in issues of equity and social justice in mathematics education. She has taught and tutored secondary math and physics abroad and in the US. She has a BS in physics and a BA in mathematics education from the University of Michigan and an MA in social foundations of education from Eastern Michigan University. The workshop is engaging statistics teachers through connections to the teaching of school statistics and educational equity issues. Take it away.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Stephanie Casey. After you've heard a little bit about us, we're going to ask a little bit about you. So I'm going to launch a quick poll that we're trying to get a sense of who our audience consists of. So take a second to fill yourself out as one of these job descriptions. All right, we've got 85% response rate. I think that's pretty darn good. Looks like we mostly have college statistics and mathematics instructors. So that's really helpful for us to know as we cater our presentation to you. So let me move on to the next slide. So the theme of eCOTS this year is engaging everyone. So we want to talk a little bit about how we feel our workshop meets this theme. So we're first going to talk about pre-service mathematics teachers. We really feel that pre-service mathematics teachers are an important audience that we should attend to in the statistics class that we're talking about here in eCOTS. So we want to make sure we include them in everyone. So what are some ways that we think are important to engage pre-service teachers? Well, we want to connect to the teaching of school statistics in the work we're doing we have pre-service teachers in our classes. So how do we connect to the teaching of school statistics? Well, we purposely choose content topics that are most important to teachers. We purposely choose data sets that are pertinent to the work that teachers are going to be doing. We have artifacts of school teaching, such as videos of what it's like to teach, videos of lessons of statistics from K-12 settings or student work samples. And then we also think it's important to have lessons that develop their knowledge of how students learn statistics. There's quite a bit of statistics education research that can be really helpful to them in preparing to be teachers of statistics. We also think it's really important for us to model the way we want them to teach in the future. So paying attention to active learning and equitable teaching practices are 2 important ways that we think that can happen in our college level courses. Another way that we want to talk about engaging everyone is using statistics to examine equity and social justice issues. Now, this is important for everybody, certainly not just pre-service math teachers. One way it's important is that it brings statistics closer to the lived experiences of all students. Everybody is living in society and we're all dealing with issues of equity and social justice. It also is really motivational because there's a great potential for use of statistics in equity and social justice issues to make a difference in the world. And that's really something that particularly current generations are looking to. Particularly looking again at thinking about pre-service teachers, it really is important for them to develop critical statistical literacy, how to use statistics to read and write the world around them and use that to make a difference. And that also, we want them to see this idea of critical statistical literacy as a model for them to use with their K-12 students when teaching, to engage their students in that way as well. So let me tell you a little bit about where we're at in today's statistics teacher education. Sounds like many of you are college stats level folks, but where are we at in K-12 setting? So as far as the US curriculum goes, we currently have higher expectations about what is to be taught regarding statistics in secondary schools than there has been in the recent past. And a call for more statistics and data science in K-12 settings is just getting louder and louder and louder. And I'm sure I don't need to convince you of the need for that in the K-12 setting. When we talk about what's the current trends in teacher education, there's a lot bigger emphasis on learning based on the practices of teaching. So we want teachers in their pre-service training to be doing things like they're actually going to be doing when they are teaching. Also, there's a bigger emphasis on equity literacy, and I'm going to go into that a bit more in a little bit later. However, when we talk about resources for helping teachers learn equity literacy and the practices of teaching in the context of teaching statistics, there's really limited resource. And that's probably part of the reason that new teachers feel least prepared to teach statistics compared to things like algebra, geometry, calculus, etc. So this is an area of great need. So our work is situated within a larger project called the Modules Project. Of course, it has to be an acronym. Module stands for the mathematics of doing, understanding, learning, and educating for secondary schools. So it's a big grant. You can see lots of different universities are listed along the bottom. It's an IU's grant from the National Science Foundation, and it's also run in cooperation with the APLU. So the goal of the Modules Project, one of the primary goals is to develop university mathematics course materials that have a focus on developing MKT, mathematical knowledge for teaching. And across the large grant, we have 4 content areas that are included there, statistics being one of them. And so we're going to talk mostly about the statistics modules materials and the work we've done in this grant. So you're looking at 3 of the people listed on here. So the way the modules grant is organized is that every writing team consists of an expert in the field. So our expert statistician is Dr. Andrew Ross. There's also to be an expert mathematics educator in that content area. That's myself. I'm the statistics teacher ed person. We also have a member of our team who isn't able to be here today. Her name's Samantha Maddox, and she's a grade 6 through 12 mathematics teacher. I think this is a great thing that the project has done, is to make sure that we have an actual practicing teacher who's in the classroom every day, seeing the realities of teaching statistics and providing us insights on what teachers need to know in order to teach statistics well. But I also was a high school statistics teacher for 14 years, so I do have that background too. We also have Melody Wilson here. She was our graduate research assistant on this project. She's a former high school math teacher, and she's continuing on right now with her studies at University of Michigan towards a PhD in math ed. So altogether, if you look across the curriculum materials that our modules grant has written for the statistics area, we've got 3 modules, which if you put them together would be the curriculum of a 3 credit hour stats class. And these are the topics that they cover. Pretty standard for an intro stats class. But we're going to talk a lot in this presentation about what are unique things we're doing with those content areas. So I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with the organization called the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators. And a couple of years ago, they put out a publication called the Standards for Preparing Teachers of Math. And these standards present what our current feelings are in the field about what we need to do to prepare teachers in their pre-service education. So we're going to focus in real quick on what they're talking about regarding equity, because we're going to talk a lot in this workshop about how to deal with preparation for teachers regarding equity in our statistics materials. So one thing to point out is that an assumption that these AMTE standards put out as their very first fundamental assumption is that the success of each and every learner requires a deep, integrated focus on equity in every program that prepares teachers of mathematics. And when they go in to talk about a deep integrated focus on equity, they're talking about the idea that it's no longer okay for them to have one class that might talk a little bit about equity in it, and that's it. It's fundamental that we're talking about issues of equity and education and how to address that in teaching across every course that they take across their entire program. So even the college level stats class, we want to address that. So digging a little deeper, this is one of the key standards in the AMTE standards regarding equity. So the context here says, well-prepared beginning teachers of mathematics realize that the social, historical, and institutional context of mathematics affect teaching. And if we dig a little deeper into those, we can see that these are some of the things they're talking about in that. So some of the things we're doing in our statistics materials are meeting these standards. In fact, across all of our materials, we feel like we've got all of these hit. Some of the big ones that we talk about quite a bit are things like, how do we provide access and advancement? So we look at data regarding who is getting access to which math classes and who's getting advanced into which math classes. And we break that out by things like gender and race and think deeply about that. So that's just one example. We're going to be digging into more as we go through the workshop. So like I mentioned, we're really paying attention to those AMTE standards, but we also, again, want to increase their likelihood to use statistics to uncover and examine equity and social justice issues, both personally as a citizen of the world and with students as a teacher to model and get them doing those type of activities as well. And we also just want them to increase their confidence in teaching equity and social justice topics. These are important topics to be working with K-12 students. And so we want them to get confident to be able to go out into their own classrooms and teach lessons like these that address those. So I'm going to turn it over to some colleagues here as we talk through some of the activities and get you guys engaged in some of the activities that we do in the modules that attend to these things.
So our first activity for the eCOTS workshop is from our Module 1, Study Design and Exploratory Data Analysis. And this is an activity in there where we're interpreting graphs. And we could have used graphs about what students' favorite animals are, or their favorite sports, or all kinds of science and engineering and technology things. But we decided to interpret, to have students look at and interpret a segmented bar graph that's about mathematics tracking in secondary schools to help increase their equity literacy, help them become more comfortable, and to understand these issues as they themselves might be making decisions about who will go into what track if a school hasn't detracked. So we start them off by the day, here we go. The day before the activity in class, we have them watch a video, and we won't play the whole video here. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, but we'll just play a few seconds of it. So our pre-service teachers have thought about that the day before they come to class, and they even, in some cases, type in their answers in a learning management system. And then when they come to class that day, we show them the following graph. It comes from a blog listed here. And some important things to note about this graph is that the racial composition of all high schools in general is the farthest left bar, and then all the other bars are specific to particular types of STEM classes. So here comes the graph. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about this graph. So again, the far left bar here is all high school enrollment across the entire United States, and then different kinds of STEM related classes. So one thing that we've already got our students thinking about by this point in the class is to kind of frame things for themselves. What do I notice about this graph? And what do I wonder? Like, what does this graph make me wonder about? So we'd like to get your impressions on this graph. What is it? What do you notice? What do you wonder about? So for that, we'd like people to type in the chat, but we're going to try something a little different maybe. Sometimes once something is said in the chat window, then that inhibits other people. So we want you to type your thoughts about it in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to type their thoughts, and then I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, go, and everyone will hit enter for the chat, and then we can all spend some time reading everyone's thoughts. So I'll do that in a minute or so. So take some time to type your thoughts in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. All right, so hopefully people are typing in their thoughts. Getting ready. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Wow, that's fun. Okay. I picked up that tip from a webinar about online teaching, so it's not my idea. I'm not taking credit for it, but it is fun. Okay. So let's see what we see in the chat here. Hispanics are lower proportion for Calc and advanced math, but Hispanics are higher in Algebra 1. Black students are also low for calculus. Largest percent is white. Who is in the white group? Who is classified white and who isn't? Students taking Algebra 1 later grades are disproportionately minorities, right? So that's an important thing to think about, that not every bar in this graph is for an advanced class. Some of them are for classes that indicate that those students have been delayed and are taking classes behind what we would expect based on the usual standards. The Asian and white percentage increases. Why is that? The difference is stark in calculus. So hopefully everyone's looking through the chat here. Wondering about the third bar, Algebra 1, grades 11 and 12, right? So that we would think of that as kind of not performing with the rest, or not placing with the usual population. All right, so I think a lot of people are noticing kind of similar things there. How the figure would look different if the ordering of racial groups was reordered? That's a very good question. Are you thinking of putting white at the bottom maybe, or should it be different within each bar based on the largest and second largest and such percentage? So this is just the graph we got from the blog that we referred to. We did have to touch it up a little bit so you could see it if it was printed in black and white, but other than that, it's, in some sense, it's, what's out there rather than us making it up specifically for pedagogical purposes. So our pre-service teachers read through this graph, and we do the what do you notice, what do you wonder? And then we also ask them to interpret the graph at 3 different levels, and this comes from a framework by Curcio. The first one is, let's read the data. So just kind of picking out individual numbers just to make sure people understand the graph. So we want our pre-service teachers to do that for themselves, but then we also want them to write a question to sort of a future class that would require them to read the data. So an example question there would be, what percent of the students in high school physics in the United States are Asian? So there they really just have to go to one bar and pick out one number. And then reading between the data is looking at different numbers in the graph and maybe comparing them. So hopefully they would write a question like, which high school mathematics and science courses have a higher percent of Asians enrolled in them than expected when considering overall high school enrollment composition? So there you're comparing overall for Asian, which is this category, and comparing that to some of the others, saying which are higher than the 5%. And then reading behind the data is looking at the big picture. What does this graph tell us about the overall situation in the US, or what does it make us wonder about it? So you could say, which, if any, of the high school math and science courses have a notably different racial composition than high school enrollment overall in the US, and what factors might explain that? So we're looking to say, what does this graph say? And then have courageous conversations about what those causes might be. We're also, let's see. So then we want to talk about connections between educational tracking practices and the data, and the tracking practices they learned about in that video that they watched ahead of time. So we've deliberately selected this graph to advance our pre-service teachers' understanding of the social context of STEM teaching and learning, which is one of the AMTE standards in that C.4 category. So this is just one example of the way that our materials incorporate information and thinking about racial inequities in the US in the course materials. We have a total of 8 activities that we would say are kind of equity or social justice related across all 3 modules. Another sample activity here, I'm just going to basically describe it to you quickly. So in our module 3, which is about statistical association, both numeric like regression and categorical like two-way tables. So we hope our teachers, our pre-service teachers will develop the ability to summarize categorical data into two-way tables and make segmented bar charts using CODAP. CODAP is a free online data analysis software, and we use that extensively throughout all the modules. So if you haven't heard of CODAP, I really recommend you go play with it. Ask us more in the chat if you want to know more. We hope they can interpret two-way frequency tables to look for anything interesting going on, and in particular use conditional relative frequencies to say whether there's an association between the variable in the rows and the variable in the columns. And in this case, we are considering some common US racial stereotypes and how they compare to actual data. And these are stereotypes that relate to the education system. So we launched the activity with just describing the US General Social Survey, which is done by the US government. And we give them a data extract with, a fair number of rows here, 1,000 rows, and sort of demographic data, and then the people's opinions on some issues like how interested are you in local school issues, spending on education, confidence in the education system. And we just let them think, usually put them in kind of groups of 2 or 3 and say, what could you do with this data? What questions could you investigate? And then we just turn them loose. At this point in the semester, they've been using CODAP a fair bit, so they can just start making graphs and tables and stuff. So each group can investigate their own question and maybe then have a whole group discussion about what each group found. And then to focus it in on our target for this lesson, which is about categorical data analysis, we give them a common stereotype, and it's kind of hard to say these things out loud sometimes, and that's okay. That's part of courageous conversation. But the stereotype is that Black families value their children's education less than white families do. And then we ask, well, what does this data set tell you about the data? Make a graph, and then they usually have a paper copy of the activity in front of them. So when they make a graph on the screen, we ask them to sketch that into their paper copy just to keep a record of it. And then we ask, what do you notice about that graph? So here's the likely first graph that they make. So this is a two-way binned dot plot. Here we've just simplified the data set down to Black and white people. Just to streamline the conversations. We do give them the full data set later if they want to go play with it and investigate other questions. So take a minute to think about what's going on in this graph. And then we pose this question to them. A lot of questions in our materials are phrased this way. If a student said this, how would you respond as their teacher? So they have to take a minute to think what's going on in the student's thinking based on what they said, and then how do I kind of ask probing questions to lead them to where I need them to go, rather than just saying, you're wrong, think about it this way. So we pose this question: if a student pointed out that there's 340 people here, but only 140 people here, and those aren't the same, so there's some association or something, what could you say to that pre-service, or what could you say to that hypothetical student? Now you might have noticed this probably isn't the actual best graph. It's the easiest one to make in CODAP, but it's not the best. It doesn't use conditional relative frequencies. So then we lead them through the procedure for making this graph in CODAP. And we define association and say, would you say there's association between these two variables? So take a sec to think about it for yourself. You don't need to chat it out. Is there association between these two variables? And what have we discovered from the data set here? And then all along the way, ever since the first module, we've been kind of having them keep a list of what might be affecting society in the US that produces gaps in income, et cetera. and a list of factors that are possibly internal to the group, something like interest in education, or factors that are external to the group, something like legacies of housing segregation policies from the 1930s and all sorts of stuff. And so then we ask them along the way, when they see data on something like this, to go update that list, maybe cross out something that they had listed or list something new. So this is one of the very courageous conversation equity kind of discussions that we have. So now we'll turn it over, and Melody will talk about this activity.
Hi. So we're gonna get you involved again in an activity that we do in our study design and exploratory data analysis module. So this activity is designed to develop pre-service teachers' pedagogical skill in a very specific way, as well as helping them imagine how statistics teachers might empower their students to work for social justice, their secondary students. So this has a little bit of a different twist. We're going to need to set this up a little bit by showing you what the pre-service teachers have been learning in the lessons leading up to this lesson. So the first thing that we should go over is that we've talked about sequencing a class discussion. So I'm not sure if you've seen this diagram before about having great in-class mathematical discussions, but sequencing the order in which you call up students to present their work is actually something we ask pre-service teachers to think about. What would be the best way to sequence this work in order to build mathematical, in this case, statistical understanding? So we also teach a learning framework that is called the case to aggregate learning framework. And we ask pre-service teachers to keep this framework in mind as they're thinking about how to sequence this class discussion. So it's called the case to aggregate learning framework because what it basically says is that the first thing beginner students will do when they see a data set is to identify one case of the data, like identify, here's me in this data set. And then the next level that they move on to is to use a classifier, such as if I were to put everyone in the class into categories, we could say 7 people's favorite color is red. And then the final level that students move into is the aggregate view of data, where you're looking at the whole distribution of data and seeing characteristics of that distribution. So the last thing pre-service teachers will have done to prepare for this activity is to have watched a video. Actually, they watch a little bit longer video than this, but we're going to show you the short version. And once they get this video, this is going to give the social context of the activity that you're about to dive into. So go ahead and play that. Okay, so that's sort of setting the stage. That was a real protest that happened in Detroit. And so what we're going to ask the pre-service teachers to do in this exercise is to imagine that they themselves are the math teacher of these students who did the protest in the fall when they return to school and they're learning statistics in their math class. So we're going to ask you to pretend that you're the pre-service teachers and actually engage in this activity. We'll be sending you to breakout rooms in just a moment. But before we do that, let's just a few instructions to help this go more smoothly. One is that when you're in your breakout room, make sure and choose one member of your group to write down your answer. It'll be a very brief answer they can write down. And then when we come back, we'll do the 1, 2, 3, go thing that Andrew taught us so that everyone can put their answers in the chat window. The other thing I'd like you to do before we go to breakout groups is to make sure you can find the activity at the bit.ly link that you see here on your screen. It's bit.ly modules, all in capitals, Act 3, because it's our third activity today. So I'll wait a moment and okay. So we'll take about 10 minutes in your breakout rooms, and feel free to put up a hand. This should be a fun activity, and when we come back, we'll kind of role play a brief in-class discussion that we might have with the pre-service teachers. All right, have fun. Okay, great. So what we'll do is we will use Andrew's 1, 2, 3, go method, and we'll have everybody go ahead, whoever was the scribe for your group, go ahead and type in your answer without pressing enter yet. Let's do this. 1, 2, 3, go. You know, I thought that might happen to some groups. We didn't finish. We got too interested and talked too much. And 10 minutes is really too short for this. There's so many things to notice about these graphs. And yeah, I hope that your interest was piqued by it. And it's also a great way to see what CODAP can do in a very short time. I mean, a high school student could make these graphs in a matter of less than a minute just by dragging things on their screen. So let's hear from one of the groups that did write down a specific order of presentations. Let's try the group, well, boy, I can't see your group numbers on here, but let's say Samuel Pinkava, are you one of the scribes for your group? And would you like to unmute and tell us about your reasoning behind the order that you put there? If everyone looks in their chat window, you can see that their group typed Tina, Rashid, Crystal, Jose, Alicia.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we decided on Tina, Rashid, Crystal, Jose, Alicia, because we felt that went from the more general information about the, so with Tina, you could see a histogram of the travel times, but she didn't really go into the reapportionment part of the data. And we felt that Alicia, you could see the most information in Alicia's graph. So we felt that Alicia sort of had the most to say without having too, her graph wasn't too busy. We did have the question whether her graph was too busy, but we could see that Alicia had the most to say.
So you would have her go last because of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Did anyone else think differently about Alicia's graph? It looks like a couple of the groups listed her in the middle. She was towards the end for most groups, it looks like. And this is interesting that we're getting this result, because I think that when we did this with our pre-service teachers, their mind was so keyed into the context of the problem that they immediately went to what graph is going to be the most effective one to publish in the newspaper or to put in a letter to the school board when we advocate for this thing that we want. And sometimes the most effective graph is actually the one that's the most case oriented. It feels very personal. You can see the names there, and you can see each student, where they're coming from and how long it's taking them. So that is an attractive graph, and I think the class might vote to have that be the one that you put in the newspaper. But so in this exercise, we're pushing our pre-service teachers to identify the graph that students might start with based on where they are in their learning trajectory, which would be a case value graph. Actually, Alicia's graph might be the graph that they would start with and relate to the most. And then what we're trying to have the conversation do for the students is to scaffold an understanding of more aggregated data that doesn't actually seem to say as much. But when we see data displays with large data sets that have thousands of cases, we have to be able to interpret aggregated data. So while those graphs aren't as attractive, we pushed our pre-service teachers to think about how they could scaffold an understanding of histograms, which look very boring, but we see them all the time. So I hope you enjoyed this activity, and there's so much more to talk about, but I have to hand it over to the next speaker here.
Oh, that's me. Part of our materials, we have our pre-service teachers simulate what it's like to be a teacher. So we call it a simulation of teaching practice. And in module 1, which is again is about study design and exploratory data analysis, we pose this prompt to our pre-service teachers that in a hypothetical future class that they're teaching, students have made project proposals, and now it's up to our pre-service teachers to think about those project proposals and respond to the students in a teacherly sort of manner, not just saying, oh, this is wrong and that's wrong, but saying, you know, asking probing questions and that kind of stuff. So this is something that probably most of the people in this webinar have already had practice doing, right? If you make your college class do projects, and they might do proposals and you respond to them. So the really novel thing here is that we're asking college students who are training to be teachers to put themselves almost in our shoes, but in a K-12 setting. So here's the specific prompt that our pre-service teachers are responding to. So take a minute to read this and think, how would you respond to this student? You don't have to chat it out or anything, but just to put yourself in that frame of mind. So you might be noticing what kind of issues are going on here. Is the plot that the person is proposing actually the best way to analyze the data? Do they have a large enough sample size? Is the measurement system reasonable? So we ask our pre-service teachers to first make a video of kind of their internal monologue of things they're concerned about with this proposal and things that it does well that they wouldn't say to the student directly, and then talk to their video camera as if they were talking exactly to the student and ask questions about things to get them to think deeper about some of the things they really need to think about before they go launch this project. All right, so let's go to our next workshop activity. And Stephanie's going to take over here.
Okay, so in our third module, which is about statistical association, the very first portion of the module is all about quantitative data. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fact that in middle school, students are expected to learn about something called the informal line of best fit. So this activity is about how you would interact with students who are doing that, and how would you respond to them as they present their work to you.
There we go.
Okay. So like I mentioned, in middle school, 8th grade to be particular, students begin to learn about association of quantitative variables by fitting lines of best fit informally. So this means without technology, nothing to help them, they just need to place it by eye. And the idea here is that this is going to build students some intuition and thoughtfulness about what a line of best fit is and what it does and what criteria it has to help lead up to what they do in high school regarding learning about the least squares regression line. So I've done some work in this area, and in lesson 1, part of that content is the users of our curriculum materials learn about common student approaches for placing the informal line of best fit. And part of that's done through watching videos of common student approaches to doing that. And then what we ask the users of the materials to do is, describe the student approach. What are reasons or sources they might use for developing that approach for placing the line? Think about whether that approach is generalizable. Is that in general a good way to place a line of best fit? And if not, make a scatter plot showing a counterexample to illustrate the downfalls of that approach to placing the line of best fit. They also have to practice making responses to students and develop a larger lesson. So as a follow-up to that, we have another video simulation of practice. Like Andrew mentioned, this is the idea that they have to practice talking out loud as they would to students in their own classrooms. So we have 2 students' work presented, and they have to record a video where they interpret each student's work and provide a response to students in the role of the teacher. So like we have with other areas, we're going to have you practice doing this as well. So this is the scatter plot that you're going to see the work of the students regarding. So we have the students are told information about the scatter plot, about how it represents the relationship between how many people are going to the movies with respect to how much it costs to go to the movies. So there's a little background of the context that's given to them. And then they are shown the work of one student. First, they're given the student Martha. So the idea is that they're using spaghetti as their line when they're putting it on their paper to make the line of best fit. So that's why you're seeing a bright yellow line in the digital version here. So there's where Martha put her line. And you can see right below it, it tells us she placed the line there because I was trying to get the spaghetti on as many dots as I could. So we're going to ask you, we're going to use that same 1, 2, 3, go method to do the following. First, think about why Martha might want to get her spaghetti to go on as many dots as possible. What's reasonable or worthwhile about that? And then second, if you were Martha's teacher, how would you respond to Martha? Again, your goal in this response is either to help the student complete their thinking if you're not clear about what Martha did, prompt the student to investigate an error if they made one, or help the student, in general, you want to help the student move forward in understanding the line of best fit. And just a reminder from the 8th grade standard, what they're wanting students to come to is an understanding that the line of best fit is closest to all the dots. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to craft your response, and then we'll share them in the chat. All right, I think it's my turn to try this. 1, 2, 3, go. All right, so this is fun to read everybody's ideas and responses. Interesting connections that some people are making. Camille mentioned that this placement of the line is similar to the idea of mode, the mode, which one happens the most. You're trying to get through the most dots possible. Somebody else mentioned wondering if, is Larry, wondering if students who are more case-oriented tend to be students who try to hit as many points as possible. So again, this focus on individual cases could be something that's important to, is making that connection there. Yeah, getting them to understand that all the dots need to be close to spaghetti rather than having the spaghetti on as many dots as possible is something that many people are mentioning. And I can say that based on my work that I've done with students about this, that is not an easy transition. In fact, in my study that I did, I flat out asked students in a prompt, is it more important to make the, it was two lines of best fit, one went through points, as many as possible. The other one was as close to all the dots as possible. It actually was the least squares regression line. And a third of the students preferred the line that went through dots. And they said it was because it went through points. So getting them comfortable with the idea that the line of best fit doesn't need to go through any points. And in fact, it's better to be close to all the points as in turn of going through actual points is no small effort. There's definitely work that needs to be done to get students to transition to understanding that. So I think that idea of suggesting that is good, but I think it's also important to help students understand why. Why is it important that we want to make sure everything's close to the spaghetti? That's something that we have to work with students on. Yeah, the idea of linking the meaning of the line of best fit as something that we use to make predictions, I think could be productive in responding to students. I like that idea that Anne shared. And yes, you could definitely have some conversations about what do we mean by closest? How do we measure closeness? But again, in 8th grade, you're not going to get too technical. You're not going to be making residual plots or anything like that. But you definitely could start talking about the idea of residuals. Okay, so let's look at one more student. So Taio placed his line here, and his reasoning was that he wanted 4 points above the line and 4 points below the line. So same idea, think about what would make Taio think that's how you should place the line, and what would you say to him? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Okay, let's see what people had to say for this one. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, so quite a few people are noting that this is tied to the idea of median, median having half the data points above and half the data points below. Corollary in the scatter plot situation certainly is a reasonable connection there. Now there's a question about, you know, does it create a reasonable line or not? Certainly Taio's graph that he has here is not unreasonable. I would say for an informal line of best fit, I would call that reasonable. But in general, this is not a generalizable approach. And in fact, there's many ways that you can place the line of best fit on this graph that has 4 points above and 4 points below that are very inaccurate lines of best fit. You certainly could angle it the other way. I know this may be hard to believe, but in my study, some students who had more, like they were given scatter plots, but their mind still was thinking of this in a univariate sense, placed vertical or horizontal lines with equal number of points on either side, saying that that was the line of best fit because it was in the middle. So just this idea of putting half the points on one side and half the other really needs to be expanded upon and thought more about in order to always place an accurate line. Some people are trying to transition to thinking about the mean, which I think is a really interesting idea. This is the median. What would the mean line look like? An average. And yeah, a lot of people are starting to talk about distances at the points that are above the line to distances at points that are below the line and comparing those totals. I'm also trying to draw attention to some of the points that are pretty far from the lines and seeing if that raises any red flags to Taio with his approach, if that would bother him at all. One last thing I wanted to mention is that Martha and Taio's approaches to placing a line of best fit are two of the most common ones that I found that students have. This idea of putting equal number of points on either side of the line and going through as many as possible. So it's likely that if teaching this with students, you would have students in your classroom that would be thinking that was the correct approach. So it's good that we're getting them used to thinking about common approaches out there that students would have. Okay, we're going to move on. This is the rubric that we have aligned with this activity. And I just wanted to bring this up here so you can see what are some things that we're attending to when we provide feedback to the pre-service teachers or whoever's using this. So one thing, you know, is their interpretation of the student thinking reasonable? Does it make sense that they think that's why the student's thinking that? And then is their response appropriate? Is it moving them forward? And then is the language used appropriate? Are they speaking in a language, use of language that's appropriate for 8th graders? Also, we have the instructors, after they give feedback to the pre-service teachers on their responses to those students and their video responses and get the rubric responses, we have them reflect on that and say, how would you change your responses to these students after getting your feedback from your instructor? What are some takeaways for you about how to build on student thinking to move students forward towards a learning goal? And because this is module 3, we have them reflect across all their work that they've done so far and think about how do the responses they give to students now differ from those you gave prior to taking this class. So getting them to try and use some of that metacognition and really think deeply about responding to students. This is really an important thing that we're emphasizing right now in math teacher education. And so we want them to develop their skill in that best we can. Okay, we are on to our last activity that we're going to share with you guys, also from the Statistical Association module. It's near the end, lesson 9, and this one is about curriculum standards. So a part of statistical knowledge for teaching is familiarity with the curriculum. What do students learn when? How do previous ideas build to what I'm going to be teaching? And how does that lead to ideas in the future? So just to talk through a little bit from this activity. It starts by displaying 2 of the standards from the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics that are about association of categorical data. Certainly, I'm not expecting you to read all the details, but just that's what this is. We have the 8th grade standard and the high school standard. So the first question we ask them to consider is, what prerequisite knowledge do students need in order to be prepared to learn the content in the 8th grade standard? So what is really important for students to know and understand in order to be able to think about association of categorical data in 2-way tables? One of the biggest ones that comes up there is proportional reasoning. That is really a foundational to be able to make sense of two-way tables. And so we want to make sure that our teachers know that. Another question we ask them, oh, can you go back, Andrew? Another question we ask them is about the fact that these don't mention graphs. And so we explicitly want to call that out because we spend a lot of time on the use of graphs for analyzing categorical data for statistical association. So this idea, you know, even if it doesn't mention in the standards, it doesn't mean it's not a good idea. And using those graphs can help them do these things. We also have them compare and contrast this with a probability standard, which also is talking about two-way frequency tables and finding whether events are independent. So we have them think about how does that relate to these standards we just talked about in statistics that were about two-way frequency tables? And how is independence concerning probability the same or different as independence concerning statistics? So how is that idea changing? They're talking about independence there. We were talking about association with statistics. Are they one and the same? What are the differences between them? So really teasing out those important nuances that are different between the two. We also have them look at the AP Stats standards briefly and to see that in AP Stats, they go beyond the exploration of categorical data, although they do expect them to use bar charts, to also do inference. So they talk about the sampling distribution for chi-square and the chi-square test for independence in that course. And so again, this idea of the building of the curriculum, we ask them to name at least two ways the chi-square test for independence depends upon ideas developed when exploring categorical data. So getting them to unpack that progression of the building towards chi-square test. So perhaps through our presentation, your interest in our modules project has been piqued. So we strongly encourage you to check out these two websites. The top one is the overall project website. We're still in the middle of the grant, so our materials will be publicly available to everybody for free spring, summer 2022. But we are still looking for piloters. We're still getting the kinks out. So we would love to have folks use our materials and or if you know colleagues, please share that second URL with them, the modules to pilot. The next piloting opportunity for statistics, we're gonna have training summer 2021, and then you would teach with the materials during the 2021-22 academic year. And there's little money associated with it, which is also, of course, nice. So we've left a little time for questions here at the end. I'm gonna let Megan moderate that because I know that's part of her duties, so.
Hello, everyone. Yes, if you can, please post questions in the chat and please make them available to everyone. If you posted questions in the chat in the session, it's a little harder for me to keep track of. I took a picture of two of them, but please, if I don't happen to say them, please repeat them. I apologize. I didn't have a way, my usual way of storing things. So for the first question that we had from earlier on, it was asking about a module where you were asking students to prepare questions. And it says, how did the future teachers do at coming up with questions to ask? Maybe more importantly, how did you give them practice at coming up with the questions? When I've asked my students to do that, they really struggle, and I wanted to find good ways to help them, but I've had trouble coming up with ways to help them practice since I can't find a way to scaffold it.
So Andrew, I think that came from your example with the tracking segmented bar graph, the idea that they were asked to pose questions at those three different levels of the Curcio framework. So do you mind answering?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's been a year since I taught it. So.
Oh.
Oh boy. Yeah, that whole semester is just kind of a fog. Yeah, I agree. It's hard to scaffold. One thing you can do is ask, like, give them an example and say, now, is this a good example or not? Or give an example and ask them to say whether that's kind of just reading the data, is it reading between the data or beyond the data, to just get them thinking about the framework. So that's an idea. I don't know.
Okay.
The idea of giving them opportunities to just show their curiousness, like What are you noticing? What do you wonder? I think just more practice with open-ended prompts like that can be useful for developing their ability to ask questions when presented with data.
And the other question that I happened to keep track of was on the first segmented bar chart. It had, does advanced mathematics mean pre-calculus? Do you happen to know? No. Okay.
I don't remember. We could go back and look at that blog post. It did stand out to us. I saw someone in the chat said, what about statistics? And it did stand out to us that statistics was not in that
Right.
list of classes.
Okay, so we have a question now in the chat. Is there a difference in whether you frame this as educational equity or social justice, as you have done in other places?
Larry, could you say more about that? Was there one of the topics in particular you're thinking of, or just the overall?
He says the overall.
Well, we're actually doing a study right now where we asked our pre-service teachers who are in the pilots that are going on in various places this semester. We asked them some questions about their views of equity at the start of the semester, and then they're filling out their post surveys basically right now. And so hopefully we'll get that data in a month to see how much did their equity point of view change, or their critical statistical literacy. Larry, were you asking about, do we use the word equity versus using the word social justice?
Right. I mean, you've used in different presentations or papers, you've sometimes used one word and sometimes used the other. And I was just curious if you've gotten any pushback when you use the word social justice, which some people feel is more loaded, even though you're still doing kind of the same thing.
Part of the difference in our choice of which phrase to use has been the emphasis of the presentation. So with this particular presentation, we actually decided to focus on examples about issues of equity with respect to education things. In other presentations we've done, we focus more on social justice things. So we do have some activities in our materials that we didn't share today that we've shared in other presentations that were more of that social justice slant. Like, how am I going to take what I know about this situation and use statistics and go make a difference in the world related to that? So for me, that's our difference in the slants of the presentation.
Thanks. It looks like really wonderful work. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, thanks, Larry.
So as going back to the writing of questions, as teachers become better questioners, are they able to translate that into better instruction? What do you think?
Well, we like to think so, definitely. I know Alan Rossman definitely thinks so. He thinks, he's got the blog and everything about asking good questions as the key to better instruction. And I think there's certainly evidence in mathematics education research that shows that better questioning is better instruction in many respects. Students get more involved. It leads to deeper understanding on their part of the material.
You're making sure that you're actually getting the understanding that you think you're getting when you ask more questions and better questions.
That too, yep.
It reminds me of Jo Bowler's study that she did with high school math teachers that were experimenting with detracking their high school math. And the fact that she observed teachers that really helped them be successful in this detracking effort was that they would debrief almost every day and talk about what questions they had asked their students during that class activity. And they would sort of help each other maybe reframe that question to be more helpful to the students. So that was a huge theme in their sort of departmental cooperation in helping that effort.
Wow. Wow. So as background for drawing real life conclusions from the data on interest in education, it is relevant to discuss why or whether the sample of those expressing interest in education is representative of the U.S. population in general. For example, is it from a university lab school or from an urban public school? Did you know where that came from?
Yeah, the General Social Survey is done very carefully by, I think it's the Census Bureau, but it's not actually the census once every 10 years. And they put a great deal of care to making sure that it's representative of the whole US. It's actually more complicated than a simple random sample, but in a good way. But we tell our pre-service teachers, you can treat this basically as a simple random sample of all US adults. So I'm sorry we didn't make that clear in the webinar here, but that is in the materials.
Okay. They, the GSS website also has a really nice about page. I've sent my students to go and take a look at that just to kind of get them practice doing that. Is this project essentially a statistics methods class? Do you get into discussion about equity as well as statistics? What is the diversity of your students?
I'll field the first question.
Okay.
So this is meant to be used in the content course that pre-service secondary math teachers take regarding statistics. So we feel like most pre-service programs for secondary math teachers have one stats class they require their teachers to take. Even though we do understand the American Statistical Association encourages 3, that would be wonderful, but the reality is most programs don't have space for that right now, so they've got 1. So this is meant to be used in that typically 1 stats class that they take. Yes, there certainly is a good amount of material in here that one could consider statistics methods, such as, how do students learn statistics and those types of things. But it's integrated and interwoven within their learning of the statistics as well.
We should clarify, we think of this as an intro statistics class, that this is, we wrote the modules to work that way rather than presuming that the pre-service teachers have already had like a Stat 101 sort of class. But you could also use them in a class where your pre-service teachers have had a Stat 101 kind of class, and then you could spend more time on the pedagogy things and less time on the basic stats things.
So are there only secondary education majors in the class, or do you have others who might be in there as well?
It depends on the school where it's being used. At Eastern, we've taught it twice now. I taught it once, and Stephanie just finished teaching it with only pre-service teachers. Stephanie's were actually elementary, so she probably has some reflections on that. Mine were all secondary ed majors. But in the piloting we're doing as part of the NSF project, it's being used in at least one place that was a mixed class where they only had 4 or 5 pre-service teachers and 20 or 30 random other majors. Part of the thinking there is that we want everyone to learn statistics, whether they're a pre-service teacher or not. And a good way to learn statistics is pretend you're teaching statistics.
Yeah, I think it would be a great opportunity.
Can we go back to the other part of the previous question? Do you get into discussions about equity as well as the statistics? And what's the diversity of our students? So the teaching profession in general is not as diverse as the US population. When I taught it, all of my students, I suppose you would say, would identify as white. I actually had a fairly good gender mix. Stephanie, what did you have this semester?
Well, because I had elementary middle school teachers, I was 99% female and all white. Eastern Michigan University, as a university, is pretty diverse.
Yeah, just not our program.
Those who go into teaching at this point are not so diverse.
Do we get into discussions about equity as well as the statistics? Yes, we definitely do. And we're very, very grateful that Melody was our GA for this, for writing it, because she really brought a lot to it that we wouldn't have been able to bring. Melody, do you want to say something about the kind of equity discussions we get into? Or?
Yeah, I could just say a bit. In the teacher preparation program that I went through myself, I was in some classes that really did a good job of structuring conversations around kind of thorny issues that are hard to talk about. And so I sort of took those professors as my model from here on out, as far as if I'm doing teacher education and I want to bring up a conversation like this, here's how I'm going to sort of tiptoe into it. And one way was by surveying everyone at the very beginning of the course about just sort of, who are you, what's your background, and are there certain things that that are really hot button issues for you? What can you share with the rest of the class about how we can be sensitive to you and support you in our conversations? And then we had this funny little thing where we had them fill out a survey about whether they were likely to get offended versus whether they were afraid of offending someone else. And almost everyone was afraid of offending someone else in our case, but none of them really thought that they would be offended. And so just knowing that helped the class sort of loosen up a little bit and be a little more willing to throw out ideas and questions. People really do clam up and they're very quiet at times like these, especially when you bring up race and education. I mean, it's just so hard to talk about. But our student teachers did report that they felt more comfortable at the end of the semester with those kind of conversations than they did at the beginning.
And we spent some time talking about what does equity mean? And was it 5 definitions of equity from various historical periods? So all of them are kind of plausible and have been thought of as the definition of equity as the US has gone along, but maybe different people are kind of set on different aspects of it.
Melody, could you, I'm very interested in having those conversations about difficult topics. Besides the survey, can you give us any more? I know we don't have nearly enough time, but could you give us a couple of other idea or two about that?
Sure. I think that one thing that helps these conversations go a little better is just people in the room knowing each other's names. As simple as that is, and just being forced to use each other's names in conversations and refer to what so-and-so, what Jane just said really made sense to me because I found that my professors insist on that. They were very strong on that in every class I've had that had those kind of conversations involved. And even having the class come up with a set of sort of ground rules at the beginning of the semester about what's a good way to participate in a conversation like this. What kind of behavior would you like your classmates to exhibit towards you when you're trying to say something and maybe you're saying it not quite right or in a way doesn't feel politically correct? Just sort of opening up, like, how would you like to be supported in that? So it's still not easy. I'd say that as students take more classes that have conversations like that, and as they've had good experiences, they become more and more willing. But it is pretty hard to get the ball rolling at first.
Right. Yeah, I could see it being really difficult for people to, on both sides. They don't want to offend someone, but they don't want to be hurt either. And getting that balance would be really hard.
Like Melody said, I think that's where that survey result was so useful to show, I know you're overly concerned about these things, but look at what we're saying, people aren't so worried about getting offended. So it's going to be okay. The other thing I'd say from my teaching was I found it really helpful to establish small groups right off the bat in my class, and they kept with those small groups and they developed that community there, and they were much more comfortable having those types of courageous conversations, as we call them, with their small groups. And sometimes I would bring it back out to the whole class, but sometimes I wouldn't, especially at the beginning of the year. So starting in a small group setting, I think, is another way to manage that.
Building that small trust first before coming out to the whole class. How big were the classes typically?
I had
each of ours was about 20 students, I think.
No, mine started out at 13 and then I lost 2, so it was 11.
Oh, okay.
And I actually did kind of random group assignments each week, but the class kind of ended up functioning as one large group anyway, but in an efficient kind of way. Like the groups would work and then they'd turn around and talk to each other. So that worked really well for us. But 11 is such a nice small class, but still enough to be critical mass.
Right. I mean, particularly with an issue that might be considered sensitive. 11 is still, could be a crowd if you're uncomfortable. So I want to thank Andrew, Stephanie, and Melody for a wonderful workshop. Thank you very much. It was excellent. I love the way that you are adding some of the interactions, and I am taking that 1, 2, 3 posted in chat, and I'll be using that. So thank you very much.
I just got it from someone else. I'm not taking credit.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you back tomorrow. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.